on population. I don't know what really started me on a lifelong interest in population, but I do know that at the London School of Economics, when I was studying anthropology, I became very interested in population. I'd been interested in it actually in my second or third year as an undergraduate at Oxford, and written a long essay about the Industrial Revolution and what caused it, which went into the question of population. But at the LSE, I got seriously interested. I went to lectures by leading demographers like David Glass, and I investigated the area of population, and my first published article was in New Society about population and the fact that anthropologists hadn't paid it due attention. And in it I predicted dire consequences for what was happening in the world, because the population bomb, as it was then called, was widely discussed. We think sometimes that concern with ecology and the fate of the earth and so on is a fairly recent phenomenon, but actually in the mid-late 60s there was a huge worry about how we were destroying the world and our resources. There had been a period before the Second World War when demographers like Glass thought the world population was shrinking again, but it became pretty clear after the war that that wasn't true, and the predictions were that if we went on in the rate we were going on, then the earth would be uninhabitable within 100 years. So there was a lot of scary stuff around, and I found it a fascinating topic. I went to excellent lectures on Roman demography by Keith Hopkins, and I looked at all the accounts by anthropologists of population in small-scale societies. So when I went to the School of Oriental and African Studies to study for a PhD, I chose as my theme population and resources in the Himalayas. This was directly about the themes that interest many people now, namely the effects of growing population on the resources, on the forests and on the waters and the mountains in a very vulnerable, fragile area in Nepal. And for years after that, I've been interested. I taught population studies when I first came to Cambridge with some leading demographers like Geoffrey Hawthorne and the members of the Cambridge group, and I've written a long book on comparing population and medicine and other factors in Japan and England, the Savage Wars of Peace. So whatever it is that interested me, and it interested my mother and it interests my wife Sarah very much now, it's been a central concern. And I've learned a few basic things about population. One is the thing I learnt from the great expert Thomas Malthus, which is that there are no laws of population. In his first essay on population in 1798, Malthus said that there was an iron law whereby population would always in the end outstrip resources, because population can double every generation, so you get exponential growth, whereas resources can only go up arithmetically in a steady line, and therefore every few generations you will get a crisis, and the terrible positive checks, as he calls them, war, famine and disease, will bring the population down. And if you look at the long and disastrous history of the world, that's what's happened in every major civilization. Every few centuries, a population crash caused by overpressure on resources or other factors, the weather and so on. So I learnt that was Malthus's laws, but in the second edition of his treatise on population, he modified that entirely. He looked at more detailed demography, particularly in places like England, Norway, Switzerland, and he found that in those countries they had actually for long periods had a level population. It hadn't grown substantially. And if he'd known about Japan in more detail, he'd have known the same thing happened for a couple of centuries between the mid-17th and the mid-19th century in Japan. And he said that this was because what he'd taken to be a law was a tendency, all else being equal. If no one makes any effort, if there is no institutional pressure against it, then population will rise very fast because women will marry or have children at an early age, and with normal mortality, the population will rocket. But in these particular cases, that didn't happen for various reasons. In the West, in England and Norway and so on, it was because the age at marriage was very high. Women on average married at 25 in England in the first part of the 18th century, and about a quarter of the women never married at all. So that is what held down population. Malthus was against all forms of contraception, which he thought were vice, but you didn't need it because people restrained themselves. They waited until they were wealthy enough, and then they had children. So hold off. In Japan and a number of Pacific islands and others where they've had to restrain their population because they live in harsh environments, it's not usually very late marriage. It's usually preventing births, and the two main forms used traditionally in those places were abortion, killing off children before they were born in some using various traditional methods, or killing them or allowing them to die when they were born. And these are pretty horrible and harsh, but people said better that than that we all starve, as we will if we allow this to go on. So different methods were used, but in these cases the iron laws were suspended, and it was a tendency. And this is what I think of now when I look at projections of the future world population. If we don't do anything about it, population will continue to grow. It's growing very fast still because of the absolute number or base, nearly 8 billion people, and therefore you only need a small growth rate to have massive growth of population. And there are countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East and elsewhere, where population is still growing so fast that the world population won't stabilize for decades. And when it does, we'll have perhaps twice as many people as we do now. The other side that I learnt about was that on the resource side, the assumption that resources can only grow in an arithmetical or linear way is partly true, but modern science changed that a lot, as Ernest Gellner and others pointed out. In other words, we, through our knowledge and the application of science to technology, we can increase yields, as in the Green Revolution, or with the use of various fertilizers or whatever. We can, and genetic engineering, we can produce more food, we can produce more of the other resources we need. It's not infinite, of course, and we'll run out of everything soon enough if we go on as we are, but there is, in principle, we could, if we are clever and successful, we could feed the world as it is now and even larger, and we could have enough energy and water and everything if we thought about it and worked it out. So we are not doomed. It's just a tendency, and we can, through the application of our thoughts and ideas, deal with it. Unfortunately, we're unlikely to do so. Population is a subject which many societies find they can't even really talk about much. There have been one or two that have grasped the nettle, as the cliche goes, and a famous one was China with its one-child policy, which was draconian, and we now know possibly unnecessary, since the birth rate was coming down very rapidly just before it was introduced, but it certainly had some effects. But it showed what you could if you really wanted to do. But other countries which tried, like India, Rajiv Gandhi and others tried to introduce a similar system, and he ended up assassinated, not directly because of that, but the population policy wasn't successful, and India is still growing rapidly. The other thing that was a discovery that I used to teach my students was that what is the best way to increase the institutional pressures against very large families is growing wealth, a consumer society where you begin to value other things more than having lots of children. The insecurities of a very poor society where your children are really your only investment, where when you are old or sick you need lots of children, where the political system is very fragmentary and you need your wider family to protect you. All those things, plus perhaps a belief that you need to continue the line of ancestors for religious or other reasons, all those have pushed societies onwards, plus the fact that many minorities and extreme groups like Orthodox Jews believe that it's their duty to procreate and preserve themselves. All those things tend to be mitigated or changed with growing affluence, though not always. And also, above all, people said, if you can educate women, because in many societies the only role for a woman really is to marry, probably young, and have children and be a wife and mother. If she has other opportunities, if she's educated to 17 or 18, even that pushes up the age at marriage. And then if she gets a job and is independent, she may not want to marry, or she may choose who she marries or put it off for a while. So the education of women has been an important tool in trying to reduce population growth. But it's a very complex subject, and one which many people don't even think about or talk about. It's one of those macro problems, because much of it is your own individual behavior, maximizing yourself and your family, often against the good of other people at a wider level. So you are under family pressure, or you yourself wish to have lots of children, and it may be in your advantage to do so, while for the whole society it's not. So it's a problem very like others, like car ownership or even gun ownership. What is good for the individual is not necessarily good for the society. So it continues to be a subject I'm interested in, but I did notice that when I went to Cambridge in 1975 and started teaching population, there was a lot of interest, and I taught it again in the 1990s a bit. I don't think it's now a subject that there's any, for example, a special paper which we ran on it, and it's faded away, and you hardly ever hear people discussing it, except occasionally on the periphery of the discussion about the ecological problems and global warming. But it is terribly important.